say if you extracted resources from an asteroid, you would have to be able to justify how bringing those resources back benefits not only the country conducting the operation, but the world as a whole.
Okay.
And so under that common heritage principle, which is one that these non-spacefaring countries all prefer, anything collected, found, researched in space is essentially the property of all mankind rather than one individual or whoever discovers it.
Hello and welcome back, Difference Makers. It's Dr. Jim Hoven, your host of the Ramos Law Difference Makers podcast. And as those of you who listen to us or watch us often are aware, I get a coolest job in the world where I get to meet people who are doing cool things that are making a difference, making an impact in the lives of the world and their world. And today is no different. And today I get to speak with one of our attorneys here, and I'm so excited. His name is Matt Bulow, and he is a fantastic attorney. He's new to us, and he also is doing something that I find super fascinating that I don't know anybody else who has done, and his focus is on space law. You heard it right. Like, wait a minute, does space have law? And we're going to talk about all that today with Matt. So Matt, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining me, my friend.
Thank you for having me on. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. So let's talk first just a little bit about you. How in the world did you decide that you wanted to go into space law?
I would say space law kind of chose me on this one. I got really lucky. I went to the University of Denver School of Law. So I've been in Colorado my whole life, went to CSU for my undergrad, went to DU for law school. And I was fortunate enough that in my 2L year, my second year of law school, DU brought in a professor who had expertise in space law. And he, of course, pitched to them, can I teach a class on it? And they opened up for the first time that year a commercial space law course. I saw that on the registry and I said, get me in there.
Was it popular? Was there a lot of people in it?
Not too popular.
Okay.
It was, they limited the course size a little bit because the professor it was during COVID, so he didn't have the ability to teach a huge class.
Yes.
And so they limited it to, I believe it was 25 students. So I was fortunate to be in that first class. And I just fell in love with commercial space law. He had so many great connections and was able to bring in a bunch of awesome people, like, for example, some people connected with Boeing, Ball Aerospace, things like that. He brought in attorneys, engineers, all kinds of really awesome guest speakers that were able to come in and just give us so much information on space law. And as lawyers, we had the law background, but we had almost none of the technical expertise. And so it was just so cool to learn all that space stuff and then try to apply what we were learning in school and the law to it. And that's what Professor Milton Skip Smith came in and did a great job with that and said, here's the framework of space law, and then here's how it actually works, and here's where the money comes from, and here's all that good stuff. So I fell in love with commercial space law, and then after commercial space law, I spent 2 years on the DU moot court team for the International Institute of Space Law, Manfred Locke's moot court that they put on each year. And that is where they have teams from law schools across the country and across the world compete and argue hypothetical cases against one another. And I did that for 2 years. Again, I was fortunate because space law was so small. There weren't that many people trying to get in and take my spot the second year. So I was able to do it again and got an extra year of experience in space law, and I loved it. And so that was really it. DU kind of introduced me to space law, and I never let go of it.
How new is the field, space law, compared to other types of law?
Very new. I would say space law and aviation have kind of grown up together in a sense. And that is because as aviation became more popular, international aviation law had to develop, to allow planes to fly across state borders, things like that. And so pretty soon after that, in the late 50s and 60s, the space age began, and we saw exploration, satellites being launched, and eventually people going into space. And so that was kind of an extension of aviation law at that point, where they said, we got to get the international community together again and determine how we can do this without getting in each other's way, essentially. And that's the basis of aviation law is we don't want planes colliding. The basis of space law is we don't want space objects colliding and causing damage. And so that's pretty much how it grew up. Started in the 60s with a couple of the major space powers at the time, which was the USSR and the United States were the big two. And they kind of, as the first people out there, got to say what space law was, essentially. They said, here's what we're doing. It can't be illegal because we're doing it. It's not causing issues. And so it kind of developed with whatever the US and the USSR said. And then eventually as more space powers came in, including, China, India, there's a bunch that I'm not listing here that are fantastic space powers, but as they came in, they wanted their say. And so it eventually kind of fell under the auspices of the UN to get these countries together and try to put together a comprehensive body of law. And we are still working on that. And I would say we are still in the infancy of that because it is just such a long process, especially because international space law has to be determined by consensus. So yes. So the big two, again, now Russia and the US, they often will say, no, we don't like that. We're going to do something else. And that brings the entire conversation on whatever topic it is that they disagree with to a halt, essentially. So,
is China a big space power?
They are indeed. They actually just recently completed may be the wrong word, but they have, I'll use it anyways. They've completed construction on their own space station for research purposes. And so that is very similar to the International Space Station, except this one is China's own version.
And is that kind of thing, this fascinates me so much. And you are part of our aviation division with the thought of, you're going to start with our aviation team and then lead us in the expansion as space, that we're going to grow that. Like you said, they've grown up together. We're growing that division up together because we've got a big jump on aviation with the top team in the country and doing what we do for aviation. Now this side, and what intrigues me about this is, we just talked about China. You mentioned India. You got the US, you got the USSR, you have all these different people, and they have to come to consensus. So for example, we know that China has its way of doing things where, hey, we're not going to show you anything. And all the countries do that, I'm sure, right? So with this space station, we have the International Space Station where we've combined with the USSR. Is China forced through space law to make that an international thing? Or can they say, no, this is off base to you. This is just us? So
you've just struck on a very interesting facet of space law, which is in the Artemis Accords, which the U.S. is kind of trying to build international cooperation for exploration of the moon and other celestial bodies, as they call it, looking with an eye towards Mars in the future. They call it transparency. I may have gotten ahead of myself, but there are 5 big treaties that kind of came about in the 60s and 70s, with the major one being the Outer Space Treaty, signed by, again, all the major space powers, and I believe it's up to like 90-something, maybe even 100-and-something signatories these days. And so that is considered... Wow,
100 countries are going into space?
Not necessarily. So again, the Outer Space Treaty includes what are called launching states that have the capability of launching their own space objects with rockets. They can launch satellites, all that good stuff. So there are those launching states, and I believe all of them are signatories to the OST. But space affects everyone, as I'm sure you can imagine. These satellites that are launched, just because the US or Russia or China launches a satellite doesn't mean Mexico or a European country, anything like that, doesn't mean that they don't benefit from these satellites, or that they may even own some of these satellites that are being launched into space. And so all of those countries want their voice heard, and so they signed onto the OST so that they're able to have a say in that and kind of be able to talk about, just because we're not launching things doesn't mean we don't care about space law and what goes on up there. And again, the big thing is satellites provide a lot of terrestrial use to people on the surface of the Earth, far beyond just the launching states and the people who put the satellites up there. And so all these countries, and in my opinion, every country on the planet should have a vested interest in space and what goes on up there.
Wow. And so I was just thinking as you were talking, the law is there for a couple things, right? It's there from a lay person's perspective. The law is there to help us have a guidepost on what at least we would hope most of us agree helps the majority of people. And then it's also there when things don't go that way, what's the ramifications? And so in space law, everything we've talked about in these first few minutes is international. Is there international consequences for breaking the law that basically the two superpowers kind of run the show or have? Now we've got this group of 100 or plus countries. So is there a just like, hey man, it's a good old boys thing. Just we have this law, but there's no teeth to it. Is there an international space court that says you screwed up? And how do you apply whatever pressures or penalties if you break the law?
That is where space law needs some development. Absolutely. I think you kind of hinted at it in that one of the drawbacks of international law is that it often doesn't have teeth and that it is difficult to enforce. Space law is no different, and in fact, probably the epitome of that. There are big superpowers that we really aren't going to be able to stop from doing what they want in space. So we kind of have to work within their parameters and say, we get it. You have the technology. You are pushing us forward in that sense. And so essentially, the law will not try to restrict, that kind of innovation. But there are issues that come from that. And like you said, the law simply lacks teeth sometimes. There are a couple instances of satellite collisions. One is probably the most famous satellite collision. A Russian satellite, Cosmos, came back and landed it had a nuclear power source on it. And it came back and, I'm forgetting the word, but it broke up, coming through the atmosphere back to Earth. Yep, disintegrated in the atmosphere. But large chunks of that space object landed on Canada's territory. And so it was a Russian space object. That was pretty clear. They launched the satellite, but their satellite landed where it wasn't supposed to. Most satellites come down, hit the ocean, not a big deal. This one, again, landed on Canadian territory and caused some significant damage. I don't believe it was significant by most standards, but it was enough to warrant them reaching out. And that one avoided courts and all that. And if it did go to a court, it would end up in the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, or the International Criminal Court in The Hague. So those would be the two international courts that deal with these disputes that would end up being between states rather than private individuals. But in the case of Canada and Russia and the Cosmos satellite, Russia ended up settling off the books, essentially.
With money.
Yep. So Russia said, we'll pay you to clean it up and get all that done, and then we'll forget about it. And that was essentially Russia copping out to say, we don't want to see any international law created on this, so please keep it off the books. Exactly. And so I believe they were able to come to a beneficial settlement that there's a lot of money in space, so paying one little settlement probably wasn't too much of a setback.
So what about this? When we think of space, you mentioned that you were working on the commercial side of space. There's a commercial side. Maybe there's a few sides. There's the probably exploratory side, and there's the military side. So if you have the military side of things, does space law, from how you're trained, apply to military groups, or is that like, how the JAG has its military law? Is that a separate part of space law if it involves the military and our U.S. Space Force versus Russia's, whatever they call it?
Absolutely not. In space law, the intent is to kind of make a uniform law for out there. And in fact, the military use of outer space is explicitly prohibited by the Outer Space Treaty and most of the space treaties and other foundational documents in space law. The military use of outer space is explicitly prohibited. And
so like Star Wars, when President Reagan was trying to do Star Wars, that can't be done now, or is that not considered outer space?
It would be considered. Yes, essentially these treaties are trying to prevent that. We don't want to be shooting lasers from outer space back to Earth, or lasers, at each other. We don't want that stuff going on in space. And so preventing military use is very important in space law, in international space law. But it is widely accepted that although military use is prohibited, a large chunk of these satellites are being used for military purposes in one way or another, which would be, tracking, surveillance, just intelligence stuff mostly.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so again, this is where the vagueness of all these treaties comes in. They try to use this vague language intentionally so that everything can be put in the buckets. But essentially, they try to prevent aggressive military uses in outer space. And this is something I actually argued in one of the moot courts, is that, what constitutes aggressive use of these of satellites or any space objects. And so it's a very interesting concept to see, when does a space object become a military or have a military use. And at that point, it would, again, technically it's all very vague, but it would likely violate international law if, for example, you had a satellite that was able to launch rockets suborbitally, something like that. So if you had a satellite that had capabilities to launch something back towards Earth, the hope is that the international community would all unanimously say, you can't do that. If a country did do that, there would be consequences.
Got it.
And those consequences entirely unclear, all up in the air, because as it stands now, there haven't been too many issues relative in space. Everything moves pretty smoothly, although that is rapidly changing with as much stuff as we're launching out there in space. Yes.
And when it comes to, there was a time where people thought you couldn't affect the cleanliness of the ocean. It was too big. Now we clearly know we have wrecked parts of the ocean, and that's now having a ecological, therefore a biological impact on us and our quality of life. Space is infinitely bigger, infinitely than our ocean. Is there anything about environmental responsibility in space, and what does that look like?
Absolutely. That is a big one, again, in most of these treaties and all the foundational documents, is to protect the environment of, they mention space, and celestial bodies is often thrown in there as the language, which the thought is Mars, asteroids, all these places have unbelievably valuable resources. In fact, I believe I read an article that said the first, I think it was a Forbes article that said the first trillionaire that we ever see on Earth will be the first person to mine an asteroid.
An asteroid. One asteroid.
Yes,
will be a trillionaire?
Yes, absolutely. There are certain asteroids, and they're tracked on all kinds of websites that have just
diamonds or
unbelievable amounts of resources.
Metals.
Yes, precious metals primarily, and it's just amazing the value that can be extracted from these things if we have the technology, and we're very much getting there. So
wow.
It will be very interesting. But with, as you mentioned, the environmental impacts, we may have already crossed a threshold in that sense. It's called the Kessler syndrome, and it was, I believe, a NASA engineer back in the 70s or 80s identified that we are simply putting too much stuff into what is called low Earth orbit. And as you said, space is vast, but space that is useful to us on Earth is limited. And so there's what's called low Earth orbit, medium or middle Earth orbit, and then high Earth orbit. And in low Earth orbit, that is where most of these satellites are. Oh. The big example is Starlink.
Yes.
So all the telecom satellites. And
man, you see them. It's like 30 of them or something,
yes.
And they just go across in line, uniformly patterned, and they look like little stars or little spaceships or something going across.
It's amazing. The Starlink is throwing a lot of wrenches into the environmental impact in outer space, because this Kessler syndrome, the scientist or engineer at NASA identified that we're just launching too much stuff into low Earth orbit. And as that stuff goes out of commission, out of use, becomes space debris rather than a useful space object, that debris is going to start hitting. It's going to collide with other space objects out there and create issues. And this is an immense issue, because something as small as a fleck of paint that chips off of a shuttle or something can and has cracked a windshield on I believe, a manned space flight. And so it's those small things, when you put them in orbit and they're moving at thousands and thousands of miles an hour,
like 60,000 miles an hour in some cases, right?
So very small pieces of debris can cause major issues.
And is there a way that people can be expected to clean any of this up? Because it's just, I mean,
not
once
at the moment.
it's out there,
Yep,
right?
Not at the moment. And so ASATs, anti-satellite tests, are a big thing right now. Russia, maybe it was China, I'm blanking on which country, but one country recently in the fall of 2023 conducted an ASAT test that blew a satellite to smithereens, essentially. And so now they are tracking over 15,000 pieces of debris. That's just the stuff they can track.
And that means it's no longer useful. Debris means it's no longer useful. It's not like a useful thing.
Generally, the definitions are all up in the air.
Okay.
That's the way I'm using it. So
Okay.
I'll use object as something, a
Yep.
satellite that was
Yep.
launched, useful, and debris is something that just floats around in space right now,
Yep.
may have been useful. And so that anti-satellite test, Russia or China, the U.S. has conducted them, but they just want to see, hey, if there's a satellite spying on us, doing something like that, again, military use, surveillance. If there's something doing that, can we destroy it and get it out of our airspace would be the wrong word, our space, I guess.
Well, and it's only in your space for a certain
brief
amount of time, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So there's
but it has malintent.
Malintent, exactly. And so these ASAT tests are to say, can we destroy these satellites? And we have figured out, yes, we can destroy the satellites. And now the issue is what happens to that satellite when it's not a satellite anymore. And, we just have a lot of debris to track right now, and it is just constantly building up, and it's likely there will be major issues in the future. And that is definitely a problem for my generation and the next, is to figure out how we can clean up outer space a little bit.
We can't even clean up our neighborhoods. How are we going to clean up something that's 100,000 feet away?
I know, it's amazing. And yet they have a way. The scientists can do all the math and figure out with, what do they call it? Orbital drag or something like that.
Yeah.
But essentially the gravitational pull of Earth and the moon and the celestial bodies, just all that essentially at some point can pull some of this debris out of orbit of Earth and therefore clean it up.
And so throw it now into outer space, where it's now moving it's in our solar system, but it's not in our
essentially
Earth's
just
orbit.
Get it out of that orbit. That is
push it out.
And as I mentioned, this low Earth orbit is the one of the most use, where we're putting the telecommunication satellites and things like that. So stuff that, the everyday person is getting a bunch of use out of. This low Earth orbit, we've got to keep it clean and make sure we're using it efficiently and effectively.
Yeah.
And that is one of the concerns with Starlink, is that as much of a service as it's providing, which is fantastic internet and all that stuff to remote areas of the world, is it worth the clutter in low Earth orbit?
Wow.
Yes. So these microsatellites, as they're called, are a major issue.
How big are they? Do you know how big like a microsatellite would be considered? Is it as big as the room that we're talking in right now?
There is an official measurement. I believe microsatellites are smaller than 1 foot by 1 foot.
Is that what these are for the link thing?
Yep. There's very small objects. You just launch a ton of them out there. And so
how do we see them? Is it the sun
these
reflecting off of them when they go in that line?
That's a question for the engineers and the scientists. Yeah, I've got no idea.
To see something that's by
it's amazing stuff. And there is that technology is certainly in development, I would guess, because there was conversation during my 2 years at DU of advertisements in space. So like say,
Ramos
Pepsi,
Law, we're going to be in space, baby.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll buy some satellites and a big Ramos Law will, the logo will fly through the night sky.
Like Batman sending the signal, the bat signal.
Exactly. And so doing that stuff from space is, it's very possible, and I would imagine likely soon enough, but that is another issue of space law to step in and say, is that the most efficient use of of the space around us?
I saw something. I watched this show. I'm a big fan of it. Just stimulates my creative thinking. Called Ancient Aliens.
Oh, okay, love it.
You love it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
History
and
Channel.
I was just watching one of them last night, and they talked about space and the Pleiades, which is a star system and whatever, a couple of 400 light years away or something. And it talked about that right now, and this was made a couple of years ago, that they have an opportunity for people to vacation in space for $50 million. So where does space law go into commerce? You mentioned that the commerce of this stuff is there this active thing where people have to get, like when you build a building, you have to get permits, you have to get this, there's law stuff. Is that the same what happens in whether it's Elon Musk building a resort up there or, something like that?
That's a very interesting question as to how we are going to deal with space tourism in the future, because essentially responsibility for the individuals that go on board is going to be up to their national state.
So that's not international law. That would fall more on local law?
Essentially, yeah. And so one of the constraints of international law is determining who to hold responsible in each instance. And so I'm not sure it's a solution, but the option that we have taken as a space law community is to pin responsibility on a state or a country. And so rather than going to SpaceX when a SpaceX satellite or a Starlink satellite goes down, the international law community is going to go to the United States and say, this launched from your territory. It is therefore your space object. What's the deal? What are you doing? And so
what links then SpaceX? What links him to the country?
He is operating his company from the United States. And so that falls under US law, and there's a ton of admin law and stuff like that.
For space
that determines if you want to launch a space object, you have to do the following things and qualify yourself as a launch entity. I can't think of the language, but there are, the United States in particular requires a lot out of individuals or companies that want to launch space objects. And so Elon Musk and SpaceX obviously went through all that and have established themselves as one of the best launch providers in the world. And they service just a countless number of companies and whatnot launching their satellites and their other payloads that they send to space. So that's primarily what SpaceX does, is launch services. And then Starlink is them dabbling in satellites and providing home internet and all that good stuff. So that is a huge company that I can't imagine what their legal department looks like, having to deal with the United States constantly, other international bodies and things like that.
So do they have space lawyers like you? Is that where a space lawyer gets employed? You go through a program. In your case, we're doing aviation, growing space. But if you work with us, is that thing where you graduate and you go to SpaceX and you go, hey guys, I'm here to help you be able to shoot stuff into space safely?
Sure. I have yet to meet a space lawyer who started their career as a space lawyer.
Oh.
They almost all did something else, and it varied wildly in my experience. They did a bunch of great stuff, but as it's growing up as an industry, there are more and more schools that are dedicating time and resources to it. I tried to talk DU into starting their own dedicated space law LLM program. No luck there yet. We're
going to get that done.
Crossed. Yes,
it's going to be the Ramos Law space program.
I love it. Let's do it. But so yes, there are some universities. McGill University in Canada is a huge one. Nebraska and University of Mississippi are two big ones in the United States that have dedicated space law programs. And I believe the University of Mississippi is the only United States university with a dedicated space law LLM program. And so I expect many lawyers and hopefully younger lawyers will find the interest in that I did, and they'll go and dedicate their career to it. And hopefully SpaceX, Boeing, all these places that require space lawyers will start hiring straight out of school, and hopefully they can start building expertise from day one. So
that's cool.
It's a budding industry, and as I said, even though it began in the 60s and 70s with man's adventure into space, it is still very young and in the nascent stages as far as the law surrounding it.
Do we have an official ownership of the space above our country, above our state? Do we own the space up to a certain level and then it becomes nobody's space, or is it proprietary, or is it like, because obviously you can't fly in our airspace or we're going to have a problem, right? We think of that militarily, but does that extend to a certain altitude?
Space lawyers can't even agree on that. But generally, the principle of non-appropriation in space is well agreed upon, although the parameters of that are not. And so that essentially means no one country can own or appropriate any part of space or a celestial body.
And can you determine then, so let's say someone really wants to map out their land, right? So we'll just say something on the other side of it. So Russia. Can we determine that when the satellite is over your country, you can have it doing what you have it programmed to do, but when it goes over to our country, if you were to do the same thing, it would give away some kind of confidential, proprietary, military secret. So no, you can't do. So you got to shut it off there.
I don't see that happening. I believe ownership of objects in space will pretty much end up being whoever is operating it from the ground, because the satellite's very cool out in space. At some point, there is a person operating that satellite, either operating or monitoring, omitting to operate. Yes, monitoring. So at some point, it comes down to a person on the ground. And so one of the interesting parts about space law is registration, and liability goes with that. But essentially, registering space objects grants a state ownership over that object. And so states are hesitant to register because if they own an object,
then they got to take responsibility.
They got to take responsibility. Exactly. And so registration is a very, it's just filled with loopholes right now. And so that is a major concern of the upcoming the U.S. has been leading the project with the Artemis Accords, which is trying to get a bunch of countries in to increase international cooperation as they go to the moon again. And the plan is to bring the first woman and the first person of color to the moon. And I believe 2024 is the plan.
Wow.
And so in conjunction, so this is the year. Yeah, we're finally there. And so that was the plan. We'll see if they're still on schedule. But that is NASA's plan. And that is kind of what gave birth to these Artemis Accords, which now NASA in the United States are trying to lead the charge and, again, build a comprehensive space law now that we have a bit more experience. The goal is to bring these countries together and kind of say, here are some basic rules for space as we adventure out, and more and more scientific projects are landed and conducted from the moon. The expectation is that Mars isn't far behind at this point, and so really these countries are trying to, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. We were talking about registration, correct? And
right. Yeah, they're basically trying to get their handle on what they have to do versus what they can do.
Yes, correct.
So what about this? When you'd mentioned that the first trillionaire is probably going to come from someone being able to find, attach to, extract from, and return precious metals of some sort back to Earth. That'll be your first trillionaire. Is it a wild, wild west, like a claim state when people were coming from the east to the west in America, getting to settle stuff? Or how do you dibs this asteroid? Is it whoever gets there first? And if, let's say we go to the moon, if we get to the moon, we put our flag down, do we now say we can own this? Is there that stuff going on? Or are we all like, hey man, no one owns anything out
Sure.
here?
So that is perhaps the most foundational principle of space law, which is the competing schools of the common heritage principle versus the common benefits principle. Under common heritage, that's the space is not subject to appropriation. Essentially, under that principle, no one can own any part of space. That is, if you went
land within space.
Well, you could land, and so that under that principle, it's if you extracted resources from an asteroid, you would have to be able to justify how bringing those resources back benefits not only the country conducting the operation, but the world as a whole.
Okay.
And so under that common heritage principle, which is one that these non-spacefaring countries all prefer, anything collected, found, researched in space is essentially the property of all mankind rather than one individual or whoever discovers it. That unfortunately, depending on what state you side with here, doesn't hold much water in the international community. And the principle that the major spacefarers operate by and have stated that they believe is international law is the common benefits principle, which is that innovation, exploration of outer space, just in and of itself is beneficial to mankind. And therefore, the US, China, Russia going out and exploring the moon, and even if they don't share all their scientific findings, that is beneficial to mankind because they're innovating and essentially pushing mankind forward into outer space. And so that is kind of what has gained ground here. And so the Artemis Accords explicitly state that we believe, we being the US, NASA, and all the other signatories, believe that resources can be extracted from outer space and returned to Earth and used by that country as if they are that country's.
And what about if let's say we go to the moon this year, we say, hey, we've got this thing down. There's an asteroid projected to hit the Earth in 100 years. Mm-hmm. We got to start getting stuff figured out. So we're going to start building stuff. Now, can we do that and say, this is our colony here, and then Russia can build one 100 miles away on the moon, and China can build one 1,000 miles? Is that all open for whatever? Or do you have to state claims of, I want this much moon property or Mars property?
So generally, it's kind of a first come, first serve. You could set up your base, and the general principle is that as long as it's for scientific research, things like that, you get that space, and you cannot be interfered with by another country. Even if, say, they thought that, that particular chunk of land on the moon was of extreme value, as long as, again, hypothetically, say the U.S. is already there and exploring it scientifically, they cannot come in and destroy the United States stuff and put their own mark there. But
so no space wars.
So no space wars. That's the hope.
Yeah, just like no Earth wars.
Yes, hope. All very optimistic here. Yes, yes. So the hope is that we're not fighting over land, and the caveat to that is that most states have agreed to be open and transparent with their research, and they generally agree to there's a specific word, but it's essentially visits. If a Russian scientist saw scientific value in a U.S. operation and said, "Can I come by? They'll launch me to the moon. They'll get me there. Russia will get me there. Can I come visit your space station?" And the general principle is, yes, if it's all, everything is for scientific research, we're all trying to push mankind forward. Therefore, please come on, take a look at what we're doing. And that is all well and good in principle, but in practice, I don't believe much more than the International Space Station does collaborative work, which the International Space Station is a fantastic example of when things do work. But outside of that, there's not too many examples of explicit cooperation and visitation of sites.
Hopefully that gets better. Hopefully that gets better. So I have one more question in regards to this topic. I think space is so big. There are reportedly up to 1 billion stars or 100 billion stars in our galaxy, right? And each of those stars is like our sun and might have a solar system. So by some law, I can't remember the name of the guy's law, there are 10,000 planets within our galaxy that could support life. So all of that being said, I have a hard time believing there's not something intelligent out there in the vastness of space, in the gajillions of miles of opportunity. Does space law have anything to do with what if we come into another intelligence? Is that a space law thing? Like where would that go? And again, remember, I watch Ancient Aliens, so know.
I get the feeling that is a bridge we will cross when we come to it. There's absolutely nothing I've seen, or frankly, any scholarly research on that topic to say, hey, we've got this law that will apply if we run into
in how we connect with people that would
like
come in and all that kind of stuff.
Yep, that will all be determined when we get there, which is probably not the best way to go about it, but that's the way the law works. It has to be, it can't be proactive. It has to be retroactive most of the time.
So exciting to think about. Man, this was so fun. This was really stimulating, and just the flow of information and questioning. Like, I think anyone watching or listening could really get behind where we're going and where this thing is. And probably, I'll bet you lifted the veil of what some would just call like, wow, mystery about space law and what it is. Thank you for joining me. And so as a final question, I ask this to all my guests, and it's really important to me because I learn from every one of these, and from not only the topic, but the people. So on that note, is there one piece of advice that you've either learned along the way or that you were taught, you've picked up, that has helped you form the foundation of where you are in your career, who you are as a person right now, that you'd be willing to share with us?
This might not be a revelation to anyone, but don't be afraid to make mistakes. I often find myself trying to be a perfectionist, and I can let perfect be the enemy of good or even great. And so I found sometimes it's better to just lean in head first. And if you make a mistake, so be it. Every time I've made one, people are happy to correct me in a gentle manner and put me back on my path. So
fail forward, fail fast.
Absolutely. That's it right there.
Man, this was great fun. Man, Matt, thank you so much. Mr. Matt Bulow, everyone. Hopefully you got something out of this. And if you're watching or listening and you want to have some really creative conversation with someone, share this with them, pass it along so that they can hear this and get us all talking about something positive, something cool, something creative, something that we can build together. And if you have other topics that you'd like us to talk about, please send me an email. You can reach me, jim@ramoslaw.com. Send me an email and we will find a guest to talk about your topic. So I hope you all have a great day. Matthew, I hope you have a great day. And until next time, keep making a difference.